Okay. Well, thank you for the invitation and apologies for the time change. And thank you for accommodating me. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that I am currently on the traditional lands of the Yagara people, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. Also, if there are any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander viewers here today, just be aware that there are some photographs of people who are now deceased. Okay, so I'm going to talk about children's material culture, particularly portable material culture, and hopefully that will be of interest. Okay, let's see if we can get this to work. Okay, all right. So, as I'm sure most of you are aware, the archaeology of children in deep time has been really picking up pace over the past 5 years or so. Where there are many more articles than there used to be. And of course, there's April Noel's book, and I think she's already talked to you or will be talking to you in this series. So there's a lot more interest building up in trying to identify children in deep time, and particularly in the Paleolithic period. For what we know so far and what is best known, and I'm sure you guys are all very well aware of this, but we've of course got lots of handprints and footprints of young children, some very young children, in some cases already within deep caves or decorated caves. So the most recently being recorded that in Italy, as well as famous Chauvet Cave, where they have a child's footprint of about 8 years old alongside canine footprints. And then, of course, there's the famous site Le Tout Audebert in France, where there's many footprints of women and adolescents alongside small children, having gone very deep into that cave where the famous clay bison are. And it's thanks to the Bergwing family that this site has been so well preserved. So you can see Robert here as well. And I'm sure the hosts are particularly aware, we might know the most about children from Paleolithic period from finger flutings, from their hand stencils, or other tiny marks that are in these penetrated caves. And there's a lot of discussion about whether these tiny marks are deep within these decorated caves because they have something to do with initiation rites or other significant social occasions where the children are being brought into these very damp, dangerous situations, or they may simply represent youthful exploration and play as proposed by Uko and Rosenfeld back in the 60s. I think that question is still open to debate. The next best way we know about what children are doing in deep time are from apprenticeships. So the theory is very simple, that craft skills take a great deal of time to acquire, and that advanced cognition and the motor skills needed to achieve good results the learning must begin in childhood. So this has been best seen in lithic studies, and there are just a few examples there. So this kind of identification of apprentices, which should be children in most cases, being seen through poor quality lithics or simple mistakes that masters would never make or rarely make. And more recently, image artists, in particular engravings by Carol Fritz, April Noel, and others, identifying similar kinds of things, simple mistakes or just not the mastery that you would see elsewhere. So the suggestion is that these things were made by children learning their craft. Now, if we go back to objects, though, and move away from the rock art, we know that object play has a very deep evolutionary time in our lineage, and we know this because we see object play in present-day chimpanzees. A few years ago now, this paper came out by Kallenberg and Wrangham, presenting evidence of what they witnessed of gendered play, where little girl chimpanzees were using sticks as dolls, finding sticks, carrying them around, taking them up to their desk at nights, and generally treating them like they saw their mothers and aunts doing with the babies. So given that chimpanzees and humans had a common sister between 7 and 5 million years ago, object play has to be older than that for both of us to be doing that now. We have Australopithecines 3 to 2 million years ago. So We've got at least that many millions of years of objects, children's objects being played with and left in the archaeological record. And yet, where are they all? Apart from lithics, usually much more recent times, and particularly the engravings in Upper Paleolithic times, where's all the other Pleistocene age children's artifacts? Okay, so before I start, I would then ask you, what is this? This is made from clay. It's about this big, and I'm not sure if I'll be able to see any responses, but just have a think about what you might interpret this if you found it in the archaeological record today. Most people, when I ask this question, tend to come up with something like some kind of like axe head, or something ritual usually comes up. However, it is in fact a children's doll. So here you can see a photograph of that artifact. It's made from clay, and this is Miss Bella and Bella's friends. So these were photographs taken by Donald Thompson in the 30s up in northwest Arnhem Land, and the girls were playing at mothers and babies. So they'd made babies out of clay. So the most important part of the baby being the mouth, of course, and then they'd made themselves clay breasts, and they'd collected paper bark to rest their babies on, and they were feeding their babies just like they'd seen their mothers doing with a newborn. And Donald Thompson tells us that the girls were playing mothers and babies, particularly at that time, because a newborn had just arrived in camp the week before. So the girls were all very excited about the new babies and wanting to play mothers and babies themselves. Which then brings me to these. So these are in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. They're Yarmouktian incised pebbles. They're usually described as the earliest divine images, but why are they divine images and not something much more similar to Bella's dolls and her friends' dolls? So looking at how we're identifying things and what they are. Which then brings us to other kinds of dolls, also from the Australian context, which might be misinterpreted. So here you can see a collection of shell dolls, also collected from the north, but curated in the Australian Museum in Sydney. So these are big gastropods. They've got a little bit of fabric around them, and the children would carry them around and use them as dolls. Okay, so if we now move to something that's very famous, the Lion Man, this is like the perfect artifact for exploring how we determine when something's a shaman's tool, which is what this artifact is usually connected to. And you can see here Libor Balik's beautiful illustration of that portrayal, or it might even be a child's plaything or toy, and then a more recent painting by Tom Yorkland, who's been doing a lot of imagery lately of child just holding onto their precious toy. So this big crossover between ritual behavior and children's material culture was the subject of a paper I wrote with Marani Lister a few years ago. And in that paper, we really just wanted to highlight how much of a crossover there is in archaeological interpretation and how much of a problem this is going to be for us. And that when you look at ethnographies of hunter-gatherer fisher children across the globe, they are all cited as playing with miniature weapons, tools, dolls and figurines, musical instruments, ornamentation, collectibles, or other gaming materials. And these are the same things that are all cited to be ritual by archaeologists when found from an archaeological site. Okay, so which is it? Is it ritual or is it child? Now I'm going to focus particularly on these types of materials, as I think they're the most interesting in terms of trying to pull apart ritual from child. Now, in terms of miniaturization, those working in the Neolithic will know that there is a huge literature on the miniature items that have come from Holocene contexts, and where they're very widely associated with ritual practices as votives. And you can see some examples here of tiny axe heads and little clay body parts and little dolls. But were miniatures always used for ritualized contexts? Like, were they invented initially for ritual use? Or were they first invented as entertainment or education tools for the young and then moved into this ritual arena much, much later? So in terms of looking at miniatures in the archaeological record, this is in the deep time. So if we move back from the Neolithic into the Paleolithic or other hunter-gatherer contexts, they've been most studied in terms of miniature weapon components. So there's the lithics we mentioned before, and there's some tools, children's tools, but less so. But these are increasing in recent times. And in particular, there's Door's identification of these tiny children's arrowheads here for Blackfeet boys. And you can see the photograph of the boys there with their bows and arrows. And then Robert Park in particular has done a lot in terms of Arctic cultures, in terms of looking at how to identify children's antler or ivory and bone harpoon heads. Stappert found a miniature hand axe, which he suggested might be a toy one for a Neanderthal child. So that's the drawing down the bottom. And then I recently suggested that there might be some miniature baton perce in Magdalenian contexts also. So if we then focus on trying to identify children's miniatures as opposed to miniatures made particularly for ritual, we can look at a number of different attributes, and these are the chronology of when they appear, their actual physical attributes, and then their context. So Robert Parker just mentioned about the Arctic, and Mercer explored size for harpoon heads when they were trying to identify children's versions in these Arctic regions. And they were looking at if they could pull apart full-size adult ones, functionally small. So they're still able to function as harpoons. They have everything they need to function as a harpoon. They're just smaller. And then tiny ones, but aren't functional. They were missing critical components like line holes that wouldn't allow them to actually function as a harpoon. So this idea of using size to try and identify children's things has been out there floating around for a while. But we also want to look at whether one scale appears first, or if one scale might likely indicate use of children rather than adults. And then what would we expect for children's items made from ivory, bone, and stone being the most likely to survive thousands of years? So we would maybe jump straight to them being highly curated. So perhaps few found in the archaeological record, perhaps only discarded when irreparable, or through unintentional loss. Okay, so I'm going to focus on figurines just because we don't have enough time. And I'm focusing on figurines because there's a lot of data surrounding them, both in ethnographies and archaeology. There's a lot of attention that have been paid to these things. And here you can see a particularly nice photograph of a little girl in far north Canada with her antler doll that her father made her, full with reindeer parka. An example at the top here that I've got myself from the same area, that was made some time ago. And the parka pulls off so that you can see the person underneath. So the things that we find in the archaeological record might just be one component. It might be much more complex than we are finding. So figurines so far, again, I'm sure this is no news to any of you, but we first got those two instances very early on, back to 500 into the 200,000s, one at Becket Ram in Israel, one in Tantan in Morocco, but both of these may be entirely natural with no human modification. In terms of the one in Israel, that may not be even a manuport. So there's a lot of questions surrounding those two. And then there's a very large gap in the record for figurines before we reach Lao Manch or the Line Man and the other Swabian Jura figurines in the 41 to 35,000 years ago category. And then once we're in the Auric Nation, these both animal and human figurines really start to pick up. Of course, there's the Swabian Jura has a real collection of these, but they do start to appear in other contexts in different raw materials. And then in the Gravettian, we start to get those fired clay, perhaps intentionally exploded in cases in the Czech Republic. And then after 20,000, they really start to increase rapidly. Okay, so if we look at this data set, and what I did for this analysis was collect all anthropomorphic or animal figurines from the very beginning to about 20,000 years ago. Um, there's none in Spain for some reason, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about why that might be. Um, but if we, I then wanted to look at the scale that these things are made to. So when I did some research into different scales, it turns out that 1 inch to 6 inch scale is what's commonly known in the toy world as the Barbie scale. So we all know what scale that is. So 1 inch being to 6 inches in real life. The next one, 1 to 12 inch scale, is what's commonly known as the dollhouse scale. So this is a very popular scale for children's toys nowadays. So thinking about any dollhouses that we might have in our houses. And then there's 1 to 24 and 1 to 48 inch scale. And these are very popular for adult collectors. And I don't know about in Europe, but there's quite a thing here at the moment with making little miniature like rooms and dioramas and things. So this is very popular for adults in crafting. So if we then scale using average heights of the average male human, average female human, and then average lengths and widths of the animals, which I'll come to in a moment, we find that those early examples are much smaller. Lion Man is very large, and we'll come back to him. And then as you move through time and the sample size increases, we get more of a range of scales that's being used, but they're really falling into this dollhouse scale in particular. If we look at the Venus figurines or the other anthropomorphs, so all the human figurines by sites that have at least one or more, the bigger the sample, the more range there is in the scale that they're being produced. So it looks very much like a sample size effect. There's not one site or one particular area producing figurines at a particular scale. And then if we move to the animals, well, we've got a much better sample size, but they don't appear until after 35,000 years ago. So they initially look more like they're in these smaller scales, but then coming again into this dollhouse scale again. And this early period is probably in the 1 to 48 scale because the animals being reproduced here are the larger animals like mammoth and cave bear, where they're being made smaller to fit into a particular size. Okay, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So if we look at all of it together, almost half of the discovered human figurines thus far are at dollhouse scale. Yet 44% of those are really falling into that dollhouse scale. So the creators, when they're making these figurines, they really seem to be trying to make a figurine that measures between 3.1 and 9 centimeters in total length. And there's very few reaching beyond 15 centimeters, which has been noted by others before. And then, of course, Lauermensch is then very unusual because he's just over 31 centimeters high. So that really puts him out different from most of the other figurines. If we look at the animal figurines, larger animals are reduced to smaller scales, and smaller animals in life are only reduced to larger scales, so they could get animals of very different sizes in real life to a very similar size in the figurines. So the creators seem to be aiming for figurines with a maximum dimension of between 2 and 6.5 centimeters. So, about, I think it was like 74% of all figurines really fit into that maximum size. When I look at raw materials and whether raw materials might be influencing the size of the figurines made, it doesn't really appear. There's very big ones made both in fired clay and in ivory and bone, and then a mix in the middle. So it doesn't really look like raw material is influencing figurine size, but people really are looking for things that are less than 6 centimeters long. So this small size of figurine may or may not reflect the mobility of the community and their willingness to carry so many figurines, whether they're for children or not, or it could be that they're made for little hands. So if we just look at the chronology and size, then raw materials utilized really reflect what's commonly available for the different communities. So we can't really use that to identify if something's made for a ritual or made for a child. Most common size for the anthropomorphic figurines are that dollhouse scale, which I think is really interesting. And more than 72% of the animals are all less than 6 centimeters long. So the late appearance of figurines, though, in human material culture is a shame in that it won't really tell us a lot about the origins of ritual behavior or what we're doing with them because they are so very late. And we need to keep in mind that that's probably owing to sampling, preservation. Perhaps the earliest Homo sapiens in Africa are creating things that are plant-based figurines, or they're simply just not being recognized. And if we think back to the shell dolls here in Australia, if you find a shell in a site, you're not going to go to, this is a shell doll, it's going to be something else. Okay, so if we now move on to looking at whether context can tell us anything more, if we think about the really basic premise that if archaeological frequency reflects use frequency in antiquity, we should have more children's items deposited, given that children should be between 40 and 60% of the population. So there's a lot of children compared to adults. Um, but if there's more ritual items deposited, um, if that wouldn't be the case if only particular individuals are allowed to own these things. So here in Australia, um, shamans or men of particular rank might only be allowed to own particular things. And I'm thinking here of there's a particular stingray spine um, decorated spear that only men who have achieved certain status in their life are allowed to own. So it's really going to depend if this ritual item is restricted to particular individuals, whether they're shamans or have reached a certain stage in their life, or whether figurines are ritual, but they're allowed to be used by everyone. So in the European contexts, it's very regularly noted that they're found in domestic contexts. They're always or very, very frequently near hearths or within tent boundaries where those can be seen. And being close to hearths and within tents or domestic could be either children or ritual. So if the ritual is very much a part of their everyday life, then it could be that it's going to be within the detritus of everyday life. It's also frequently noticed that figurines are frequently found in pits, and this is usually tied to ritual behavior. So we're going to just focus on that for a couple of minutes. So Paul Petit has written quite a bit about this. In 2006, he argued that human figurines were themselves on occasion the subject of mortuary activity, and they therefore seem to have had their own lives, which terminated with death and its associating detaching rituals. And further, that pit contexts are common in Central and Eastern Europe, and when figurines have been recovered from such contexts, have associated them not dissimilar to those in male burials. So they've had bones of large and dangerous herbivores, enigmatic items of ivory and bone, like those found in similarly aged burials of humans. So he suggests that the Venuses then were recovered from pits were not subject to the clearing of domestic space, winding up in a rubbish pit, nor were they presiding over storage pits, which has also been suggested, but these pits were graves dug for those figurines. So he's arguing that the human figurines were given proper burials owing to their ritual importance. However, I would suggest that the figurines may not have been buried owing to adult agency and adult ritual ideas, but rather on the behest of a child owner user. So many of these figurines that have been found in pits are damaged. Missing heads is very common, missing limbs. So Paleolithic figurines found in pits and following ritual burial traditions could be owing to the children of that community's very close familiarity with funeral practices. You know, deaths are going to happen and they are going to see what happens, how someone is interred, unless they're kept away for some reason. And they might very well insist that their once alive friend, after a death, like their head being broken off, might be extended such ceremony. And I think all parents can know that the coercive control of small children in terms of these kinds of things. So we might then have children's insistence on burying properly their figurines to thank for their survival. So just looking at the breakage again, in the Neolithic literature, there is an extensive debate and a lot of experimental regimes in trying to determine if the ceramic figurines are deliberately fractured or not. Um, but it's very hard to determine, and I don't really know if you can determine if something has been deliberately broken or not in terms of the ceramic ones at least, but they do always fracture at weak points, which seems rather obvious, so that being the neck or the limbs most frequently. So for the figurines found in pits, I just wanted to look at one example. Here are the ones that are listed as found in pits. They're usually ivory. They come from this widespread Kostanecki Waldorfian culture, if you want to put them all together, as sometimes happens. If we look at the ones that are in pits, they're all connected like this. They're usually ivory. So it looks like the culture, this culture also has a rich burial practice, and maybe the dolls are being practiced and the children of this culture are being provided with ivory dolls. There's one interesting case at Koshneki here, the figurine 83-1. It's mammoth ivory, but it's complete with no mention of damage. So here she is. This is the only photograph I've been able to find of her. And Preslov, the excavator, talked about how she was found in a small pit about 10 centimeters deep. She was placed upright, leaning against a wall, and that she was turned to the center of the habitat towards the line of hearths. The pit of 12 centimeters in diameter on the surface wound downwards, reaching to about 60 centimeters deep. She was under a mammoth shoulder blade lying flat. A young mammoth ulna was discovered on the side. The pit had been filled with red stained silt mixed with ochre, and under the feet of the figurine, a thin layer of very fine silt was identified, on which 3 large blocks of bone charcoal had been deposited. So he then notes the huts at Koshneki were heated with bone coal, so it's consistent with the everyday huts of the people. He says it can thus be assumed by analogy this pit was dug especially for this figurine, like human huts. It was even heated and had a mammoth shoulder blade roof. It was the habitat of the figurine. So in describing this find, the archaeologists are then assuming that this was made for a ritual purpose and that's why she was there, found as she was. However, it sounds very much like a playhouse or a dollhouse. And we see this behavior of making small houses for dolls all over the planet in recent and modern children. So here I've just got some examples. In this one from Northeast Arnhem Land, you can see a little girl and boy here building little houses very much like their Mia Mia. A more recent photo of kids waiting for a boat on Timor-Leste where my colleagues work making little houses. And then some teepees from Shoshan in North America. So you can see the picture of the girls here playing with their dolls and teepees. So it might be that this doll was in a hut, not because it was a ritual, but because a child had replicated their own house like we do today and children do all over the world for her figurine. In terms of why she's still there, maybe they packed up in a hurry and she was forgotten, who knows? In terms of whether we'll be able to pull these things apart between a ritual and a plaything, I'm probably quite drawn to the idea that they're probably both. It's quite interesting that 70% of recovered figurines dated to pre-20,000 are anthropomorphic rather than animals. So there's a lot of talk about whether these figurines, some might be just ritual, like Lion Man, I think is quite a convincing case for being a particularly ritualized object. But some might be for teaching as well. And Ava at Tübingen has got a quite convincing case for the Hollowfels figurine and her markings on her belly describing the stages of pregnancy. and pregnancy being a very real part and very dangerous part of life for women, or for teaching women how to help other women through birth and pregnancy. Learning these things are going to be very important. So then if we think about, when did this overlap between ritual and child begin, or was it always that way? It is rather an interesting question to ask. In terms of why we might want to try and identify children's figurines, it would help us learn not just about children's activities and material culture through time and space, but also how children were learned, or how communities were communicating what was important to them, and at what age groups. For ritual, the appearance of figurines are very, very late. I think with the very early dates for utilized ochres and other types of things like ornaments being much older than figurines, we're really looking at the end of ritual behavior evolving in modern humans by the time they appear. So we probably need to start investigating what we've called collectibles, so unusual objects that usually aren't modified, but like crystals or fossil shells that are being brought from one place and being brought back to a home base, and considering whether that behavior is just aesthetics, or is that the beginning of ritual behavior. In the present day, children, again, love to collect unusual things. They don't need to be unusual in terms of rare. They just like rocks that are interesting colors or shapes, shells that are interesting colors or shapes, rubbish that is interesting colors and shapes. And again, I think parents will know that their handbags and pockets get filled with sticks and rocks and leaves all the time. They do cache them in special places, and historical archaeologists will find children's caches under floorboards. So we then need to look at, how do we find or pull apart a child's cache of special things from a cache that the shaman has put away for special reasons, because they could look very, very similar potentially. That's something I'd like to look at in the future. Okay, so now just to end off on looking at trying to tie things together, I thought I'd just share this story again from Australia, and how things that can look very ordinary and rather mundane to us can have much more meaning to the community that built them. I can't see any questions, so I won't try and get you to guess, but basically there's a bird bone uni points. They're very, very small. They're made from shearwater burned, and they have something to do with these beautiful large plants called the Gymea lily. These bird bone points are hafted onto multi-pronged spears, again, have something to do with Gymea lily. And then when you ask the traditional owners about these technology, a very rich history surrounding a lot of material culture all then turns up. So you can read this story about Gymea and the fishing technology in our paper on Cambridge Archaeological Journal. But just in short, it's a Dharawal love story between Gymea, also known as Krobi, and her husband Bunda. And they had a very great love for each other. And when Bunda left for battle to retrieve sea-born fisherwoman who was stolen by the Wiradjuri, so the Dharawal are on the coast of southeast New South Wales, the Wiradjuri live inland, and they used to come to kidnapped wives, women who were very good at diving and shell fishing. So whenever Bunda and the men would go to leave for battle to retrieve their fisherwoman, Krobi and the other women would wait for their men to come back on the top of the sea cliffs. But when he would return, you could see the women in all their possum skin cloaks. You can see one here, but he couldn't tell which was his special Gymea, his special Krobi. So he had her cloak fringed with red cockatoo feathers, so that when he was coming back from battle, he could see her immediately. And then one day, Bunda went to battle but did not return, and Krobi refused to leave from her post on top of the sandstone cliffs because she had promised she would wait there for her. So her community tried to get her to come down, but she would not break her promise. And eventually, the seasons were changing, and the community had to move on to their next place. So she stayed there and died on the escarpment. And when she died, her body fell down in the cracks of the escarpment. And then the next year, when the people come back, a new plant that they'd never seen before, the Gymea lily, had grown, and it has Croby's red feather collar. So you can see here the flower of the Gymea lily. That's why it's called the Gymea lily. Now, this plant is very important for fishing. They make the spear shafts from the long stalks. The leaves are created all the fishing nets, and everything ties in together. So Gymea looks after her people by providing this plant. Now, when we're archaeologists, we will find a bone point, we will tie it to fishing, and then we'll tie it to, what fish they're doing and how they're getting it. So multi-pronged spears, and in this case, usually men using multi-pronged spears. But Indigenous ways of knowledge and connecting things are very much more circular. And this is not just in the Australian context, but in other contexts as well. So I think if archaeologists really start to understand ritual and behaviours and storytellings, we need to move away from our very Western linear way of connecting things and trying to move towards this more circular understanding of life. So just to summarise, we as archaeologists, we're very dependent on identifying patterns, and if they are disrupted, erased, or altered by sample size, by preservation, cultural variants, population densities, they're very hard to identify. And of course, as we know, these behaviours need to become very common for them to become archaeologically visible. So if we're trying to identify ritual behaviours, they need to be widespread before we can see them. Just pointing out the importance of organics, because I like organic stuff, but in the earliest archaeological records, we're really just stuck with lithics for a very long time, when there could be a lot going on with the organic record. And then ritual might only become visible because of the repetition of behaviors. So rituals about doing something in a particular way, which is very good for use-way people, because that might help us identify when something's interacted with over a long period of time in a very particular prescribed manner. So in all, evolution of ritual behavior may assemble like threads coming together. So some are thinner, some are different colors, some are thicker or coming in different directions, but it's all these different types of evidence that we need to be looking to try and identify ritual and its evolution. So I just wanted to thank everyone for the invitation to speak to you, and colleagues for helping me with metrics. And just to point out that Arche here in Brisbane is looking for PhD candidates, so we'd always welcome people to come over to Brisbane. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. Now it's time for questions. So if you have any question, you can put it on the chat, or you can raise your hand. Anybody? Diego?
Yeah, I have a question. Well, first of all, thank you very much. It was really amazing. All those slides, really very interesting. Yeah, concerning these dolls, I mean, do you think these were made by the kids, or maybe they were made by adults and give I mean, because concerning the apprentice and the transmission of knowledge and all these things, it's important. This question, I think, it's interesting.
Yeah, no, I think that almost all of them are going to be made by adults. I mean, they're beautiful works of art, whatever their purpose. And I think that the problem has been that they are so beautiful and they have been so carefully crafted that we've wanted to put them on a pedestal. But they may have been made for the children of the community as well to handle. And because ivory and antler, is very adverse to breakage, these things can be dropped a lot without any real damage. So they're actually perfect for kids. But I think could be adults trying to, they're enculturating the children. This is what it is to be one of us. This is what's going to happen. This is what pregnancy is about. So I think that it is that educational. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Olga?
I had two questions. The first one was about the study you made about the different skills, and I was wondering, how did you come to focus on skill to study those dolls instead of, for example, the presence or absence of certain features like mouth or eyes or questions of style? Why the skill?
Good question. Short answer is I can't remember. But I think, there's always been a lot of focus on, they don't have faces, or they have this type of engraving, or they're this shape, or I just started thinking about might we determine if they're a child's something rather than a ritual item. And I'd read Robert Park's work on them trying to pull apart harpoons, and he'd mentioned figurines. So then I started looking at, well, what are the common scales for children's dolls and dolls' houses? And there are lots of blogs on the internet about, this is the common, this is Barbie scale, this is dollhouse scale, and then the really tiny miniature ones that are for adult collections. So that's kind of an interesting idea that adults love these tiny things. But you have this dollhouse scale that's very popular for children's toys today, and I don't see why that wouldn't be the case also back then.
Thank you. And my second question was about what you said in the beginning about the chimpanzee, about the study of, I think it was Kallenberg and Graham or something.
Yeah.
And so you said that it was a baby girl chimpanzee. And
Yes.
I was wondering if it was just one case or if it were many, and if the question of that it was a girl didn't matter or not. Did the
Yeah.
babies chimpanzees guys do it too?
Yeah, so this is Cullenberg and Wrangham in 2010, and it wasn't just one. They noticed that it was female juvenile chimpanzees that were playing with these sticks like dolls. The boys didn't seem to do it. So that's really interesting that you have this gendered play in chimpanzees. And I'm just starting to work with primatologists and looking at what chimpanzees play with. But it's quite interesting that you have, I guess, the little girls wanting to imitate their mothers and the boys not so much.
Amazing, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so anybody else? ¿Alguna pregunta? I think everything was so clear.
Let's hope so. Hi, Izzy. I see you.
Well, if there is no other question, just congratulations, Michelle. It was very interesting. It's a pleasure to hear you speaking. And I want to remember all of you that our next conference, it will be the 24th of April. This will be Primitiva Bueno. She will be speaking us about, in Spanish, this one, it will be Representaciones móviles de cuerpos de mujeres entre el sexto y el tercer milenio BC in la península ibérica. So this is all for today. Thank you very much, Michelle. I remember that the conference has been recorded. I know that a lot of people see these conferences after when they have a little moment. So it will be able in the next days. Veronica, she will upload it next week or in 2 weeks in our YouTube channel. So that's all.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you very much, Michelle.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.